Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and all the people and places and events that make Rhode Island a really good place to live. There are many people who work behind the scene, but none of them more tirelessly than my guest today, Ray Rickman. I can't tell you the number of things he does. I'm hoping he will at least tell us a little, and that we will get on the bandwagon to help the schools, to help children learn to swim, to help the libraries. And welcome, Ray Rickman, thank you for all of your interests and all of your efforts.
Thank you.
For your advocacy and your love of this city. Thank you. And it's not really just this city, it's Rhode Island. So thank you. You came to Rhode Island a while ago as a student or as a newly employed person. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you were?
So I was involved in a lot of fabulous things in Detroit. But Detroit was one of the most violent cities probably in the world, certainly in America. It was murder capital of America for about 14 years. And I had a very bad day one day. I won't go into the details, but I said it's time to go. So I studied 4 or 5 cities and picked Providence, and here I am. I got a job as the administrative assistant to the Commissioner of Welfare, Massachusetts, and realized how easy it was to take the train, and that's why I'm here instead of in Cambridge or Boston.
Can I ask you what you thought was going to be likable about Providence?
No, I picked it. It was a scientific endeavor. I picked it because it had a small black community. I'd looked at Princeton and a few other places that were fabulous, but there were virtually no people of color. So Providence was 14% black at that time, and I thought, this will be interesting. I'm coming from a city 88% black. And I didn't want to live in an all-white town. I looked at Hanover, New Hampshire. It had 3 black residents, and and it was cold. And I didn't want to do it. I'm also a historic preservationist, so Providence was perfect. And it had a low crime rate. The year I left Detroit, 880 people were murdered. Providence, 10 people were murdered the year before I came. So it was very inviting on that basis.
So you came to Providence and you worked for the government in Massachusetts, and then gradually you started getting won over to Providence as a place to work as well.
Well, no, I needed a new job. I told you earlier, just between you and me, every other person I ever worked for would get fired. I'd show up and they'd get fired. It wasn't my fault. King became governor of Massachusetts my first day of work.
Angus King?
Yes. No. He's senator from Maine. Edward King.
Edward King.
Followed Dukakis, and it was, I'm sorry, the other way around. Anyway, it was unbelievable. My boss, Commissioner of Welfare, got booted, and so did I. You boot the boss and 4 or 5 assistants,
Change of leadership.
Susan Farmer, Fred Williamson selected me to be the head of the Providence Human Relations Commission. And little did I know what a tough job it was. It really was about 1958. And I'm not talking about in real years. That's how backwards. Police were still doing bad things. Really bad things. And you saw a lot of change. I was telling the commissioner, not the commissioner, but the chief of police the other day, it's a miracle how much the police department has changed in the last 30 years.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yes.
I'm glad that's true. And you attribute that change to?
Police commissioners, mayors, I think Buddy Cianci started to make the police department be better. I didn't say he did it. I said he started it. It's always a process. And Joseph Paolino really did make some very positive changes. And then you see these three progressive mayors, including David Cicilline. They told police, you must not do that. And mayors have power.
So you think they should be stronger in their leadership?
No, I'm saying they made the police department. And remember, you don't have to really have a lot of bad cops. One bad cop can do 50, 60 things a year. And imagine you have 10 of them. You wreak havoc. And if they're messing with black teenagers, and not only did they mess with 200 black teenagers in the course of the year, mess with meaning the kids didn't do anything or shouldn't have been treated as badly as they were treated or whatever, but then the entire community knows about it. Goes to church and says, I frowned at this cop and he beat me half to death. You've got a schism. And Providence had that schism.
So you started...
I think it is so improved. Sometimes people say, they tell me about some incident. I said, I could have told you about 60 incidents. You're telling me about one. There will always be an incident. And we were talking about this. Police officers need cultural training, not cultural sensitivity training. That's the buzz thing of the time. They need to understand people are different. There's nothing wrong with being Portuguese, Greek, black. There's nothing wrong with it. It may be different than what you are, but so what? And we're probably all the same. That is, you know, you're Italian American, your grandmother didn't speak any English. What are you messing with Latinos for? In your lifetime, you had someone in your house struggling with language, and she was struggling with it going to an Italian American church, going to a butcher on Federal Hill that spoke Italian. These Latino women have 2 jobs, they're out in the street, they're learning, they're struggling. They're actually better than 1 or 2 generations ago in terms of newcomers. And we can't see that. That's a problem. It's your grandmother. She was exactly the same as this Latino woman without 2 jobs.
Yeah, I agree. I know that's my family, my history. So you came here and you started working for everyone in the city, mainly black people, but also anyone of color. Maybe all of us. But anyway, you worked hard to do various things because you would see a need and then you would work on that need. That's my understanding of who you are.
Yes, and you know, every once in a while I'm surprised. Brown University students weren't permitted to vote, and I got that done. Again, I went to Buddy Cianci and I said, this is absurd, and within 6 months they let them register and vote. So I have 20 of those, I'm not championing my efforts. It was just in your face. How can you stop people from voting? And probably being a black guy who's used to folks stopping black people from voting, I said, this is absurd. And Mayor Cianci said, you know, I think you've got a point here. And they began the process of letting them vote. One of my favorite activities ever was working with the Cambodian Laotian community, getting them involved, being treated like regular people, because they weren't. They were new arrivals. So, no, I've been involved with, I don't know, a dozen ethnic and racial communities.
You just got an award. What was that award that you just got? And I guess they went over your history and let you know what you've done in the city.
Yeah. And you know how you almost forget because they might have been great things at the moment, but then you're on to the next thing.
Oh, good for you.
And so I'm Philanthropist of the Year, and I knew it was a big deal. But today they put together this video, and you see it, and you just go, wow, I like that guy. So, but But I tell people all the time, and I think people think I'm a little strange because I say this publicly. My mother's been gone 6 years, and I talk to her in the mirror all the time. And the other day, I get a note from Dr. Toll, T-O-L-L, instead of T-A-L-L, she points out. And she's a medical doctor, AIDS clinic outside of Timbuktu in Mali. And I raised salary for her for 11 years. And she wrote me and told me, it was in French, and I had to get it translated. I spoke French, but it's gone now. She told me that I'm the reason 35,000 people are alive. And the reason for that is she would have long ago been gone to London without the subsidy I raised for her. And
well,
that just moves you. And you.
Yeah, it moves you, but moves us. My gosh, that's fabulous.
It wasn't intentional. It was just
what you did. It's just who you are.
Well, anyway, it's fascinating.
It is.
It's
fascinating. It is wonderful to know. That's fabulous. And so one of the things that you've been doing, and it's sort of the original reason that I invited you here, but there's so much else to talk about, and that is that you are taking tours, or you did this fall, take tours through Providence and show highlights of Black history. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about those, because most of us would like to go to see these places. Maybe we know them and we just need to reinterpret them.
So this is the 400th anniversary of slavery coming to America, and it wasn't properly acknowledged. New York Times did a stunning 24-page insert, just stunning. And I've probably got 20 copies of that I've given away to people. Costs a lot of money in New York Times. But Providence was up to its neck in slavery, and it's the basis of our enriched economy. There are about 40 Rhode Island families who were involved in slavery, and I'm talking about made money, the basis, the foundation of their wealth. And of course, the most famous of these families is the Brown family. And I always feel sorry for John Brown because they were right in the middle of these 40 families. They were number 20 from the top, 20 from the bottom. And the reason they have such a bad reputation is they kept the most copious, extensive notes of any family in America. Boxes and boxes and boxes at the John Carter Brown Library. So you can look at what they were doing. The other families couldn't write as well or had more sense, I have no idea. So even DeWolf from Bristol, who was the #1 slaver in America, think about that, Rhode Island. The #1 slaver in America was in Bristol, Rhode Island, enslaving people. And now John Brown actually went to Congress to fight for the continuation of slavery. So this is...
And this is in 17...
Well, this is all colonial, and it's up to about 1807. And it really is horrendous. Now at Stages of Freedom, currently, throughout for the rest of this year, we have a letter that John Brown wrote. And in the letter, he's going to broker the selling of a slave woman and her child, but only if he can find out how old the child is so he can tell them how many years they can enslave the kid. And that letter, you read it. Now this is 1763. He is getting ready, learning, practicing to be a slave dealer. It's not until 1764, most people are surprised by this letter, scholars, because in 64 he sends the Sally to Africa, a slave ship. But he's practicing, and I wonder if he did some other practicing. It is really horrendous. We need to know this. I tell people all the time, in Detroit, as a Detroiter, I knew what size shoe Henry Ford wore. I really did. We knew that stuff. You know, when the first Buick came out, In Rhode
Because it was
Island,
all in your history in school.
it's in the history in school, and you were a Ford person or a Chrysler person or a General Motors person, you know, like teams, like sport teams. It was a big thing because that was Detroit. Well, Rhode Island was slave-driven for 100 years, and folks in charge have erased this history. Now, what we do at Stages of Freedom is we take people on tours. Sometimes families call up and 10 of them get together and give us $110 and we take them on tour. We do about 3 a year. We'll do 3, probably 4 next year. So they can go to the Stages of Freedom website and see them and come. And we pray that teachers will come. And when regular people come, that's what we call people who are not teachers, they will bring a child, because they're not getting the education in the school systems. And so, now, people ask me once in a while, they can even be negative about it, why do you want this bad stuff known? And I say, right into the 1970s, black Rhode Islanders couldn't get a job. They couldn't work in the banks. They couldn't work anyplace. This is left over from slavery. You're a household servant. And that's a good job. And then later, you're able to be a doorman at the Biltmore. Now, black folks, many of them have what it takes, and off they go to Atlanta or New York or even Detroit or Boston.
To get a better life.
Yes.
Of
So
course.
we have no black middle class to speak of until the 1980s. Right now, in downtown Boston, 90% of the black people with real professional jobs live in Sharon and Seekonk and Attleboro, and they came from someplace else, and they're disconnected to this community, and all of that is left over from slavery. And so it harms the state, and it harms the black community, and will probably for another 100 years if everything got better tomorrow. Because you stand on your mother or father's shoulders, and if they couldn't excel, they couldn't buy a house.
Yes, they couldn't buy a house, yes.
Yeah. And they couldn't, by the way. They couldn't get a bank loan. No bank would loan to black folks even with money. On the east side of Providence, 3 or 4 black people own multiple houses, kind of investment things. They buy them through their Jewish friends. And you just think of a shame that no bank would loan a black person. He owned 10 houses and he could pay cash sometimes. Nope. Nope.
So these sites are for us to see, for everyone to see. And
correct. So we
tell
have
me
put
some
up
of them.
Ciceretta Jones' plaque. It's just off Benefit Street on South Court. And it is so stunning, the plaque. It costs $7,000. They call them Civil War plaques, you know, they're this big. Mm-hmm. And she was the very first black woman to make a living as a performer.
She was the operetta?
Oh, yeah. And she owned her own train. At one point, Ciceretta Jones bought 10 houses on Benefit Street and Pratt, right there on the east side. And she bought them for security. She used the word social security. Now, I don't know if anyone else had ever used that. Probably. When she retired, every 3 years, she'd sell one. And she lived off the proceeds from selling the house. Because 90% of all Americans, this is pre-Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, pre-Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, nothing. 90% of all Americans, black and white, Latino, Mexican, died in abject poverty. You worked to the day you died. The idea of retirement was non-existent. Retirement's a new idea in the 60s. You just worked yourself to death sometimes. And your children aren't much better than you. You work in the jewelry factory, and then you're a big shot. You get them a job in the jewelry factory, and for less than minimum wage. There's no savings. In 1960, only 17% of Providencians owned a home. So you have nothing to leave your children. And you have nothing, you know, if you could retire because all of a sudden you don't have high rent or mortgage. No. So this was doubly true of black people. But again, just fascinating. Then we discover things. The Shakespeare House, that John Carter owned. He was a newspaper man, postal person. He was everything. He handled problems. I learned about 2 months ago, to my shock, that he owned slaves. And I don't know if they lived in the cramped basement. The basement's only 5 feet tall, or whether they lived in his attic. But he had 11 children, so they didn't live in the main house, I can tell you that. And what was so shocking about it is I've stood on the porch of his house 100 times, I may be exaggerating, 75 times, staring at the brick schoolhouse, which is the colored schoolhouse across the street. And I never knew, I just described this house as the newspaper man's house, blah, blah, blah. But he was a slave owner. And you're just shocked how deep slavery was in this community. Just, it's the roots. Now, I'll say something else if you let me real quick. On our tour, people, new arrivals, I call them new arrivals, they came in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, white folks, who quietly or loudly tell me, we have no culpability, no blame. My family didn't come till 1949. And I tell them that this was an apartheid society till 1965. 85% of black people could not vote, couldn't serve on juries, had no rights against police, and on and on and on. And they were part of this. But they could go and buy a house in 1955 if they could put their money together, and black people couldn't. So this white privilege thing existed, exists, and still exists. And people should get off this high horse that they weren't part of the problem. Finally, the whole community, probably 70% of people made money from slavery at some point, selling bread. When you provision one of those hundreds of ships, everybody got to make the rum. Everybody got to make the cheese. I mean, in Burrillville, they cut the wood for the ships. They made the sails in Cumberland. Everybody was in on this. Everybody.
I have to say, I hadn't thought about that.
It's bad. But remember, black folks couldn't work in factories. You think about it, being an ex-Detroiter, I just giggle at it sometimes. Factories were for French Canadians, this one. This one was for Irish only. This was for Italian Americans only. They were segregated by ethnicity, and nobody black could get a factory job. Now, the truth is, you probably didn't want one, except it was, pay-wise, it was a step up from what the black folks were doing. This racism, and if you talk to the owners, the Anglo-Saxon mill owners, they will tell you, well, the Italian Americans didn't want anybody black in the factory. And I'd say, oh, so you also let them have a union and you paid them good wages? I mean, tell me, how many times the factory workers told you what to do. And I said, that would be the only time. But show me the poll. Show me the poll that said the Italian Americans would not work with somebody black. I think they work with whoever you, the owner, the boss, told them to.
Exactly.
Whether they liked it or not. You want to keep your job. So we have this history of brutal racism in Rhode Island. Brutal.
You are working on several projects now, continuing each year, not just the history talks, walks, but you're also trying to get help for the schools. You feel that the Providence schools really need help, or the schools generally need help. What can people do? What are you doing? So
we need to reinvent these schools. We need to find new funding sources. We need, you name it. Providence school system probably gets an E+. And I see bond money being spent, Hope High School and a few others, to fix them. But every school has
fix the building.
Fix that building.
Yeah,
yeah, that building.
Not the curriculum.
We have 35 school facilities, and we're going to fix 2 or 3 of them. So even there. But if every school has 10 problems, we, from what I can see, aren't fixing 9 of them. But probably every school has 100 problems. Let me give you an example. They created Parents-Teachers Night in the 1940s, 50s, and 75% of all women did not work. And they could come at 5:30 on a school night. They weren't exhausted from their day of work, and they certainly didn't have 2 jobs. And we still have Parents-Teachers Night at an inappropriate time. Now, this is what I'm talking about. The whole school system needs to be looked at. I'll just give you a small example. I'll be real quick. We need to look at how we interact with parents, particularly Latino parents. They need to sit down and figure it out. I think we need a paid staff person or staff people for Latino engagement, to welcome them into the school system to advocate and protect for their children. We don't have it. So I'm not going to get excited until I see these things. This time of year, we're busy working on swimming, trying to enroll. Our goal is 500 for the year, and we're only at 400. So I got to work really hard to put another 100 kids into swimming.
So you believe that swimming is so important because so many kids drown because they jump in with their friends and they don't know how to swim.
And they don't tell people,
And
especially
they don't tell you.
teenagers. They're gone and their family's life is shattered.
Yes.
But on top of this, have you ever been over to Laurel Mead and see the old women? You're not getting old yet in any way, but have you seen women over there swimming? And they can barely walk. They've given golf and tennis and everything up. And the glory of the moving the waves. I want this
Moving
for
the
these.
body.
Yeah, I want the black community to one day do what other people can do. 80% of black folks don't swim. Now, our program is about 45% Latino. The Latino kids show up and want to get in the program. We say, okay, come on.
Anybody can join. But look,
Well, it's for low-income folks. Remember, this is controversial. 90% of white folks swim. And people like to criticize me because our program isn't a larger number of white kids. I think there are 5 white kids this year, all from West Warwick. It's fascinating.
I'm sorry, Ray. I really am sorry. We are finished. It's
Thank
1
you.
minute till we
Happy
have to leave.
holidays.
But I want to thank you for all that you're doing. I hope this helped to disseminate some information that we all really need to hear, every one of us. So thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
And we praise the people who knew enough to give you this new honor of recognition for
you.
all of your philanthropy. So thank you. Thank you for watching Good News. We're sure there's good news around you. We're sure that you're helping to make it, and I bet that something Ray Rickman has done is going to infiltrate your town as well. Thank you.